Updates on the tragic Jeju crash. An odd close call between an airliner and a B52 bomber, plus trouble with cargo, grumpy pilots, unions and long airport queues. Yep, it's the middle of a busy summer, here in the Northern Hemisphere at least. And it's time for another look at the aviation news from the past month. As always, this includes stories that we haven't had the chance to cover in their own video yet, or smaller but still important aviation tidbits that maybe flew past the headlines but are still worth keeping an eye on. Now, we're going to start with some news around the December 2024 crash of a Jeju Air Boeing 737-800. This aircraft was operating as Jeju Air Flight 2216 from Bangkok in Thailand to Muan in South Korea. According to the preliminary report that was released about a month after the accident, the aircraft flew through a flock of birds while on approach, with both engines suffering bird strikes as a result. The crew declared an emergency and discontinued their approach to runway 01 before attempting to land in the opposite direction on runway 19. Unfortunately, the aircraft had its gear and flaps up during this approach and touched down long and fast. And the plane's configuration meant that it decelerated very slowly before reaching the end of the runway. The aircraft was destroyed when it hit an elevated concrete embankment that served as the base for the runway's localizer antenna. Tragically, only 2 of the 181 people on board survived the crash. They were both cabin crew and had been sitting at the back of the cabin. This was the worst air accident to happen in South Korea. And if you want more details, PETA presented a thorough breakdown of the preliminary report and everything else that we knew at the time over on the Mentour pilot channel. Now, the news that we got on this tragedy in July was that on Saturday the 19th, the investigators held a briefing with the families of those on board the flight to talk to them about their findings of the investigation. And I should add here that this investigation is particularly challenging because the flight data and cockpit voice recorders stopped working about 4 minutes before the crash. Now, we don't know all the details about what the investigators told the families, but we do know that after that briefing, the plan was for the investigators to hold another briefing, this time for the world's media. However, this public briefing was cancelled. And the reason seems to be because of strong reactions from the victims' relatives following their briefing. The airline's pilot union was also present and they also strongly reacted to what they heard. So what was that information? Well, it seems that the investigators believe that the 2 pilots shut down the aircraft's left engine, based on data that they'd got from the cockpit voice recorder, the flight data recorder, and the position of the engine switches in the wreckage itself. But crucially, in their briefing to the relatives, the investigators reportedly said that the engine that was shut down was less damaged than the right engine, which was kept running. Again, the relatives and their lawyers that were present in this briefing didn't like what they heard. They later stated that the investigation was pinning the blame on the pilots without putting enough emphasis, in their opinion, on other important factors. And one such factor is the embankment that the aircraft hit. Now, PETA covered this in the previous video, so here I'll just say that the structure was about 260 meters or 853 feet beyond the runway threshold and close to a concrete perimeter fence. But in any case, many argue that the embankment did play a role in the death toll among the passengers and crew. The Jeju Pilots Union argued that the investigating authority was misleading the public and trying to make the pilots into scapegoats by suggesting that the left engine had little or no damage. Now again, the preliminary report did state that bird remains were found in both engines. However, without more information from the investigating team, we obviously don't know how many birds went into each engine or how damaged each engine was. And this is obviously a very sensitive topic and a very, very difficult investigation, but hopefully we'll hear more about its progress and its next steps soon. Typically, a final report on such an accident is released about a year or so after the event, as I explained in my recent video about air accident reports. Our next story involves an unusual incident between an Embraer E175 and a US Air Force B52 bomber, thankfully without anyone getting injured. This event occurred on July the 18th and involved a SkyWest Airlines flight 3788, which was operating on behalf of Delta Airlines. This is a US domestic flight departing from Minneapolis International Airport in Minnesota and heading to Minot International in North Dakota. Now, Minot International is just a couple of miles north of the city of Minot, and as it happens, is also around 10 nautical miles south of Minot Air Force Base, which is home to a wing of B52 bombers. It appears on that day, one of those B52s was scheduled to conduct a flyover of the North Dakota State Fair, which takes place at a site that's quite close to the Minot International Airport boundary, and just to the left side of the approach end for runway 31 that SkyWest flight wanted to land on. Now, I should stress here that we only have ADS-B data from the SkyWest aircraft in this incident, not the B52. But it appears that at some point during their approach, after lining up with the runway, the SkyWest pilots were told to make a right turn because they were getting too close to other traffic in front of them. However, as the SkyWest pilots checked to their right, they saw a B52 flying in a similar direction to them and overtaking them. They told ATC about it, and the controller then instructed them to turn left, which they didn't do. Instead, the SkyWest pilot, who knew that the controllers at Minot International didn't have radar, decided that it would be safer to turn right behind the B52. ADS-B data shows that the Embraer E175 had descended to approximately 2,200 feet before their maneuver, but quickly climbed and leveled off at 4,000 feet. After that, the SkyWest pilots made another approach back to runway 31 and landed without further incident. And the reason we know this is because the captain made a long PA to the passengers after landing to explain what had happened, because he had to make a rather abrupt maneuver which he apologised for to his passengers, and presumably because he knew that the passengers on the right side of the aircraft had probably just seen a massive B-52. Now, again, we don't have the ADS-B positioning data of the military aircraft, so we don't really know how close the two jets came to each other. But we do know that the FAA is taking this incident incredibly seriously, and they're investigating it as we speak. From their side, the US Air Force also released a statement where they mentioned that the B-52's crew had been talking with both Minot Approach Control, or RAPCON, and with the control tower at Minot International Airport. They also stated that the controller at the tower did not advise the B-52 crew about the presence of the inbound commercial aircraft. But thankfully, after its flyby at the show, the B-52 landed safely back at Minot Air Base. That statement from the Air Force clears up part of the picture, but like so many aviation incidents, the full story depends on where you look. And with more than 300 outlets reporting this near miss, I used Ground News to break down not just what happened, but how it was being reported. Their blind spot feature showed me which outlets on the left and right were covering the incident. For example, NBC Miami, a left-leaning outlet, ran with "What the hell is going on?" focusing on passenger reactions. Meanwhile, the Epoch Times, which leans right, led with "FAA probes mid-air incident," framing it as a regulatory issue. Same event, totally different angle. Ground News also lets you check each outlet's factuality rating and ownership, which makes it easier for you to decide who to trust. And for me, the custom Mentour feed brings together all of the aviation and aerospace news that I care about in one place. So if you're serious about getting the full picture, not just the loudest headlines, check them out at ground.news/mentor, scan this QR code, or click the link in the description for 40% off. It's just $5 a month for a limited time. Thank you to Ground News for sponsoring this video. Now, let's get back to the story. Another story that has returned to the news cycle in July involves airline pilot retirement age in the United States, and possibly elsewhere. At the moment, the mandatory retirement age for pilots in the US is 65. It was raised to that level from 60 years of age following the passing of a law called the Fair Treatment of Experienced Pilots Act in 2007, which the FAA formally enacted in 2009. By then, ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is a body of the United Nations, had already changed its rules on mandatory retirement for pilots, raising it to 65. In other words, the new US law and FAA rules were simply aligning the United States to what was already happening elsewhere. So, what's changing now? Well, ICAO's rules still call for mandatory retirement for airline pilots at 65, but in the United States, for some years now, there's been calls to raise that age to 67. And this was because of a looming pilot shortage that had been in the making for quite a few years beforehand. The bump from 60 to 65 years postponed that problem for a while, but inevitably it then came back and the pandemic made it worse. Now, there are many more factors that are affecting this issue. For example, pilot wages or limits to the intake of new pilots, including the 1,500-hour rule that Petter has covered in previous videos. Back in 2023, the US Congress rejected passing a law put forward by lawmakers of both parties to raise the mandatory airline pilot retirement age to 67. And back then, part of the reason for this rejection was that pilots over 65 wouldn't be able to fly to most countries around the world, which would create some tricky operational issues for airlines because many senior pilots tend to fly on wide-body aircraft that obviously fly around the world. So the latest news is that a group of US senators now want the country's leadership to put pressure on ICAO to raise the mandatory retirement age worldwide to 67, or even to eliminate it completely. Their reasoning is that today we have rigorous technical and medical testing that pilots already undergo routinely, which ensures that pilots are fit to fly. And that by forcing pilots to retire when they don't want to, the industry is unnecessarily losing valuable knowledge and experience. Now, we might cover this topic in a separate video eventually, but as before, there is strong opposition against this measure, especially from pilot unions like ALPA, who warn that such a move would upset pilot scheduling and training, and it would lead to unions needing to reopen a lot of pilot contract negotiations. Now, here it's worth mentioning that back in 1959, when the mandatory retirement age of 60 was introduced for the first time in the United States, ALPA was actually taking the opposite view from what they have today, being against any formal age limit because it limited the working prospects of their members. They even helped pilots seek waivers to the rule and even sue the authorities, but to no avail as far as we know. But of course, a lot has changed in aviation since then. So what about now then? Are the United States going to convince ICAO to change its rules, allowing older pilots to continue flying airlines? Well, we don't really know the answer to that. And in any case, the United States have an early hurdle to overcome before they can even begin to argue their case. The US mission to ICAO, whose headquarters are in Montreal, doesn't have an ambassador at the moment, and hasn't actually had one since 2022 when Chelsea Sully Sullenberger stepped down from that role. Again, this is an evolving story that we may have to come back to, along with the state of pilot demand around the world, plus demand for engineers, technicians, air traffic controllers, and many other key positions in commercial aviation. For our next story, we come back to an aspect of the Boeing versus Airbus rivalry that we haven't touched on for a while, but which really matters to both of them: freighters. For decades now, Boeing has been the undisputed king of freighter aircraft, offering both newly built dedicated cargo aircraft as well as freighter conversions. Airbus has also made some freighters like the A300-600F that's still in service with UPS, FedEx and others, but their newer A330-200F freighter sold less than 40 aircraft in total. They have done better more recently though with A330 passenger to freighter conversions, but Boeing remained in the lead for mid-size freighters, and they were the only game in town for really big freighters like the 747 and 777F. But that seemed to change back in 2021 when Airbus officially launched their A350F based on the fuselage of the A350-900, but with the engines of the bigger A350-1000. Boeing reacted a few months later by launching the 777-8F, a freighter version of the 777-8, the smaller of the two 777X variants. Even so, Airbus enjoyed an early lead in orders for its A350F, with a bit over 70 orders in total to Boeing's 59 orders for the Boeing 777-8F. And crucially, 7 of those orders were by Air Lease, the 4th largest aircraft lessor in the world. And that was actually the original launch order for the A350F freighter. Aircraft manufacturers need such an order before they can commit to launching a new aircraft, or at least a new variant. But the news that we got in July was that this Air Lease order was quietly deleted from the aircraft order book and delivery data that Airbus publishes. Now, we don't know if Air Lease cancelled this order outright or if they switched it to a different variant of the A350 or even a different Airbus model altogether. But crucially for the European manufacturer, even without this order, they still have a small lead on Boeing, 66 A350F orders to 59 777-8F. And the freighter market is quite important to both manufacturers, but it is also very, very fluid. Both of these new freighters were launched when the pandemic was still at its height, a time when cargo airlines were in a very high demand. As we've previously explained in this channel, about half of the airline industry's cargo capacity is actually spare room in the hold of passenger jets. So, with almost no passengers flying long haul between 2020 and 2022, cargo companies were busy and were keen to fund some new fleet renewals. But understandably now, that market looks quite different. Still, Boeing and Airbus have been busy building their first large freighter prototypes, with Airbus finishing the first set of A350F wings at its facility in Broughton, UK last June, and Boeing officially started production of its first 777-8F in July. For our next story, we look at Boeing's recovery and its challenges once again with its worker unions. On the aircraft production front, Boeing seems to be going from strength to strength over the past few months. Production of the 737 is rising steadily, and since the workers' strike last autumn, the company seems to be gaining some much needed stability. However, that strike last autumn was by workers primarily around the Seattle and the state of Washington in general. But now, at least as we're recording this, Boeing is negotiating another contract, this time with IAM District 837, which is its workers' union in St. Louis. That's where Boeing assembles its fighter jets like the FA-18, the F-15, the T-7 trainer, and in the future, the F-47. The union members are voting to either accept a new deal for a 20% general wage increase over 4 years plus bonuses, or they could vote to strike. And that's not all. Boeing's contract with Spear, its engineers union, expires late in 2026. But before that, in January 2026, we have the expiration of a separate contract between Spear and Spirit Aerosystems, which should become part of Boeing before then. All of this means that there are a lot of eyes on Boeing's negotiations with its workers in St. Louis as the company fights to continue its recovery. Now, for our last story, we're going to have a quick look at something we've mentioned in previous monthly roundups. Our expectation that 2025 was going to be a summer from hell for aviation, due to shortages in aircraft and people, ATC trouble, airport congestion, and more. Now, I've been flying all over Europe this last week and can definitely confirm that the delays and disruption have well and truly arrived. It's been a hectic start to summer in much of the Northern Hemisphere, but some airlines have faced additional challenges. On the 20th of July, Alaska Airlines and its regional subsidiary, Horizon Air, issued a ground stop affecting their entire fleet. This was only for about 3 hours, but the 20th was a busy Sunday. And since Alaska has 238 737s plus 87 Embraer E175s with Horizon Air, untangling its operations once they were going again took way more than those 3 hours. The airline later reported that they actually had to cancel 200 flights on Sunday, plus 116 more the next day. All in all, these disruptions affected 15,600 passengers just for these 2 days, with additional delays coming over the following day or two. So what happened? Well, Alaska Airlines explained that it was an IT outage caused by the unexpected failure of a critical piece of multi-redundant hardware at their data centers, which was manufactured by a third party. Now, the airline was quick to clarify that this was not a cybersecurity issue, which had affected other industries at around the same time. Still, the issue meant that the airline couldn't run several systems that were necessary for its operations, which made the ground stop inevitable. Beyond that, the usual long summer queues of passengers waiting to have their baggage and themselves screened through security led to calls for more and better screening systems to be installed in many airports. In the United States, a bipartisan group of senators led such calls, which would involve spending around $500 million every year on new screening and explosive detection systems, plus another $250 million annually for other security-related technological improvements. Over here in Europe, Global uncertainty and late bookings are impacting some airlines, like Jet2, especially in areas where wildfires and heat waves force people to review their travel plans. Airlines in Europe or elsewhere that depend on travel to the Middle East are obviously facing a lot of uncertainty that impacts their operations and growth plans. This includes European low-cost carrier Wizz Air, which had to shut down its operations in Abu Dhabi after these disruptions and unscheduled engine repairs that grounded its jets really upset its long-term planning. Now, that sums up the main news for July, and I hope you've enjoyed being brought fully up to date. And please let us know in the comments if you saw something else in the news over the past month that you think is worth covering, either in one of these news roundups or in its own video, or perhaps over on our Captain Speaking podcast, which I hope you've gone and checked out already. I'm Ben Watts, you're watching Mentor now. Have an amazing week, and I'll see you next time.